Joe's presentation has been recorded and will be available later if you missed some of it. And our next speaker this morning is Professor Julieanna Powell Turner. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about Julieanna. So Julieanna joined CREST at University Centre Shrewsbury from Cranfield Defence and Security University, where she was Professor, Head of Research, Head of Environmental Science, Deputy Dean and a Senior Lecturer in Sustainable Supply Chains. Prior to Cranfield, she worked for the UKAEA in Culham and Beijing in the International Strategy and Policy team. Here she built on her background in environmental sciences and developed her expertise in environmental sustainability. Julieanna has worked on projects in Asia, Africa and Europe for the ADB, UNEP, DFiD, GIZ, EZ, BEIS, DEFRA, and many small and medium manufacturing enterprises. Don't ask me what those acronyms mean. She has extensive experience of working and living in China and Mongolia in the environmental services sector, where she contributed to the creation of an enabling environment for sustainable growth, advising governments on appropriate natural resource management, which brings us nicely onto her presentation today, which is about the role of resource efficiency. So welcome, Julieanna.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for that introduction. And how do I follow on from Joe Howe talking about skills? So I'm going to talk about something different. And I'm going to actually talk about resource efficiency and how this holds some of the answers to net zero. So you might ask what it is. So it's about decoupling economic development from environmental degradation, and at the same time ensuring a transition to a green economy. I think in discussing net zero, many people tend to focus on sort of energy supply and demand, whether it's renewables or other low carbon energy sources. They are important, but actually they are really only part of the story. You know, the world revolves around goods and services that are produced by businesses and consumed by you and I. And these goods and services are made from material resources, which we produce, use, remanufacture, and eventually dispose of, generating significant greenhouse gas emissions both through energy use, but also from non-energy sources such as land use change and chemical processes. So it really follows that improving resource efficiency is an important tool to tackling net zero. And the nice thing about resource efficiency, it can be implemented really quickly. We don't necessarily need new fuels, so hydrogen, for example, or necessarily lots of new technology. It's just a very different approach, which is part of the overall net zero solution. And it can include reducing waste, using recycled materials in design and manufacturing, the application of different business models around goods and services, and also changing how we consume goods and materials. And all of these can make a real contribution to net zero. So very different to kind of what Joe was talking about, but part of the equation. I think as we continue to see the impacts of climate change and also the cumulative relationship of greenhouse gas emissions over time, projects that cut carbon now are probably, you know, worth more than those that won't deliver for years to come. So ultimately, resource efficiency, you know, it won't solve net zero, and there certainly aren't any silver bullets. But if we are going to try and achieve it, you know, I think we need multiple actions working in concert, and this is certainly one of them. So how do we make it happen? Well, there's a lot of debate around COP26, you know, and how to decarbonize the energy supply system and how to reduce energy demand, you know, but the UK economy doesn't rely on energy, as I've said. You know, it relies on goods and services that we use on a day-to-day basis. And the efficiency with which we produce, I say use and remanufacture many of these goods and services, and the resources from which they're made, has got a huge impact on I guess, our carbon footprint as individuals, organisations here today, and as a country as a whole, as UK PLC. So there are a lot of efficiency gains to be made around the whole life cycle of concept, design, manufacturing, use, and recovery when considering goods. And large carbon impacts are very much dependent on the activities, the aspects and the impacts of these goods and products. I think recently DEFRA said that, there's a real growing recognition that simply measuring emissions as a country isn't necessarily the right thing to target, and that looking at consumer consumption-based measures probably in the longer term makes far more sense when we're considering the contribution to the net zero target. Sorry, Kat, I keep forgetting to say next slide, please, we're on plausible shift. Okay, when we think about plausible shifts and the goal to achieve net zero, we definitely do need more and change sort of the way that we use energy, change the way we design goods, and certainly how we consume goods, materials and products. The UK, I believe, fundamentally needs to change from, a linear, the take, make, dispose model to a circular economy. And we are seeing this, although actually it's nothing new in various sectors. But what it does involve is transforming industry, UK industry, where we, promote sustainable business models whilst ensuring, I guess, unsustainable models no longer thrive in the UK. So the mechanics of the circular economy go far beyond production and consumption. It's actually about optimizing systems rather than components, because ultimately systems aren't linear. So it's designing products to fit the material cycle, where more components are designed for use, and importantly maximizing value from assets. So this is quite a shift for many businesses. I think further to this, we saw the Discupta review on the economics of biodiversity earlier this year, so March this year, and this highlighted a real need to avoid exceeding the limits of what nature can provide while meeting the needs of you and I, and that technology again can't provide this alone. Discupta went on to say that consumption and production patterns need to be fundamentally restructured. And I think what the report really proposes is strategies that can reduce our demands on nature, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. And following this report, the Climate Change Committee, which Joe mentioned earlier, has also highlighted that cutting emissions is, it's also more about more than technical innovation. It's about changing our behaviours as individuals, which over time, I guess, will create cumulative greenhouse gas reductions, then actions with long implementation time scales. I think recycling always comes into any discussion ultimately, and it really ties into the net zero agenda as well. It's been a real success story, for UK PLC for certainly the last 20 years. It's an industry which employs, well over 100,000 people. And I think, excuse me, certainly over the last 20 years, the waste management industry, the recycling industry, it's tackled market barriers to increase recycling through better communication, material separation, collections, and behavioural change. And opportunities for greenhouse gas savings are often lost in recycling, sadly, because, although large quantities of material for recycling are collected in the UK by businesses and you and I, most of the greenhouse gas emission savings generally occurs overseas because a lot of recyclate is exported. So, for example, the UK generates about 10 million tonnes of steel scrap a year, and 80% of this is actually exported for processing to other countries like Turkey and China, for example. The US, by contrast, meets about half of its demand for steel by recycling rather than exporting. So by reducing energy demand and process emissions, recycling steel can in effect halve greenhouse gas emissions compared to production from virgin steel. So ultimately, we probably need to create new markets for recycled materials in the UK and integrate the use of recyclates much more into our supply chains so that we can keep materials here in the system as part of not over, not just a growing circular economy, but to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. I think increasing the use of recyclates in the production process rather than using virgin materials probably could contribute hugely, to the 6th carbon budget that Joe referred to by 2035. We've then got the UK industrial decarbonisation strategy, and again, Joe touched on this, but this really sets out how industry can decarbonise in line with net zero whilst remaining competitive, and also without pushing those emissions abroad. So going back to what I said about sending recyclate abroad, UK government can actually support industrial competitiveness and probably green recovery through policies in support of this strategy, which could encourage the use of recycled materials and consider the infrastructure required for new markets and sectors to develop. We could probably also consider extended producer responsibility here as well. So if we take resource efficiency a little bit further, it also incorporates substitution. And I think, although recycling is important and substitution are becoming important, they'll become even more important, both for obtaining resources and also for environmental and economic considerations. I think one of the things we need to think about is, if materials become more complex in future, they're going to be harder to recycle. So take, for example, your mobile phone, and most of the materials here are kind of part of a single functioning unit. It's really difficult to separate these materials. So in effect, the whole lot are generally smelted down together. And what we're doing, we're losing the high value of these kind of critical materials within the phone, and they're being combined into raw material for another use, but the high value is being lost, sadly. So then again, we're going to be mining again for those critical materials, which contributes to climate change and the whole carbon agenda. So I think over time, recycling processes for probably most materials are likely to become much more efficient, and probably effective as technology moves forward. But we really need to think about the complexity of materials and also some of those new technologies like 3D printing that utilizes certain critical materials. I think another resource efficient measure is around lightweighting, and I expect an awful lot of you today know all about lightweighting, and this is really where a product weight's reduced through lighter material inputs. And for many sectors, in particular energy intensive sectors like steel and aluminium, reducing the amount of materials used to create a product can significantly reduce its embodied emissions, so carbon as one of those. I think, of course, the product needs to maintain its effectiveness. It needs to remain strong enough to survive global supply chains. It needs to look good at point of sale, for you and I, and ultimately offer what we want. But lightweighting as a concept, is used in many industries, in particular the automotive sector, where car manufacturers they're making parts from carbon fiber, recycled carbon fiber, windshields from recycled plastic, and bumpers out of aluminium foam, which are all less carbon intensive, as ways to lessen vehicle load. And I know a presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, I was having a discussion about the new Porsche, and I can't remember the make, and how much recycled materials they're putting into this, and plastic in particular. And one of the delegates, was talking about it doesn't bring the cost down, which it doesn't, but from an environmental perspective, when you do a cost benefit analysis, the overall emissions are lower. I think lightweighting is also used widely in the defence sector on lots of new capabilities, a lot of digital capabilities. And the reason they use lightweighting, because it often, with certain materials, provides for increased speed, better performance, better efficiency, increased agility, maybe thermal stability, and also better fuel efficiency. So we're seeing lightweighting creeping in more and more to industries, because they can see the cost savings, but also the environmental savings. So I'm almost at the end now, a couple of slides to go. So, I think when we talk about a service economy, that can also contribute to net zero. UK PLC again is experiencing a real domestic shift from manufacturing goods to providing services. And, many of you here today might be considering how your products, and services contribute to sustainable development through your environmental, social, governance business models internally. And if you're not, I would suggest that you do, because this is the nature of where the course is going. And I think, if you take this approach, and I know certainly Mark Thompson, who is going to be speaking later, is very much taking this approach, you're seeing economic and environmental gains, which can be achieved very much through kind of a service economy. So if we take the concept of a functional economy, and the core idea behind this is that products fulfill certain functions. So, a washing machine, for example, washes our laundry, and the longer the product is used, the more often it can deliver its service and the higher its resource productivity. And also where products are seldom used, by sharing the product with a number of people, and this is all around changing use patterns, the resource productivity of the product also will increase, and the consumption of natural resources in the production stage will also be reduced. So I guess if we think about products which are frequently used, for example, again, going back maybe on mobiles, a leasing model here could be used, which allows for a higher quality of product which lasts for a longer time. So very much moving away from individual ownership, very much how it used to be, in the 50s and 60s, when people rented TVs and washing machines. I think further to leasing, there are real benefits for businesses. So, for example, knowing where your products are in the system, how often they've been repaired, having access to those materials through recycling. So I think, resource productivity brought about by leasing products, it's not guaranteed, though. That's something we need to consider. It's dependent on extending the lifetime and utilization from businesses and you and I. So there's always going to be pluses and negatives when we think about a service economy. And then finally, I think when considering a service economy, which I'm very much in favour of, we really need to think and take account of the dynamics of technical advance. So, frequently products which are undergoing rapid efficiency improvements may not be appropriate for leasing, where extending their life might actually counteract the resource productivity of newer technologies. So ultimately, what we don't want is a service economy around leasing to create additional markets, because ultimately this might lead to increased resource consumption, which therefore, increases greenhouse gas emissions and slows the journey potentially to net zero. Okay, so next slide, please, Kat. So I think really in summary, and this is, it's been a real sort of canter, gallop through, actually, and as I say, a very different presentation to Joe's. I think to help achieve net zeros, all the actions that I've talked about need to be part of very much of a holistic approach that leads to systemic change, and these actions are not part of any one policy agenda within the UK at the moment. They're really part of how we do business, how we look after our health, as well as how we protect the environment. And as a consequence, they've got real economic, social and environmental benefits. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think many of these strategies, can form part of the opportunity to build back better and also greener. And it's also a hope that when the world leaders gather in Glasgow at COP26 in November this year, that they're able to negotiate how we can work together in securing a global agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions radically and moving closer towards that 2050 net zero goal. As I said earlier, when discussing net zero, I think, we need to think about how we can reverse the continual growth in global demand through energy efficiency measures, whilst at the same time considering products and services that are produced by businesses and consumed by you and I. It's kind of critical to resource efficiency. And then when we consider decarbonising the energy system, as I said, and reducing, potential energy demand, we also need to consider product and services. As I said, the UK economy doesn't run purely on energy. There's products and services rely on material resources, and the efficiency with which we can produce, use, maybe remanufacture these creates impacts, so carbon impacts ultimately. So there aren't any silver bullets, and if we're to achieve net zero, we do need multiple actions working together, and one of those actions is resource efficiency, but it won't achieve it alone. It's just part of the solution and part of the picture. Thank you very much. Final slide. Yeah, super. Thank you very much.